All right, welcome to this webinar. I want to do a quick round of introductions as well as just set the stage, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill to get to the real meat of the topic. But to start, I am Roxanne Petraeus, the co-founder and CEO of Athena, and I'm incredibly excited about this webinar because in the prep sessions alone, I've learned a ton about the shifting landscape, as well as how HR and people professionals, many of whom are on the call today, can really help build alignment with their senior team. And given that I am a CEO, work very closely with our great people leader, Melanie Naranjo. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And then finally, welcoming Bill. He's an attorney and partner at Baker McKenzie's Employment and Compensation Practice Group. So we figure between the three of us, we represent different stakeholders involved in this important decision, and are aiming to bring our perspectives to the table. Let me do some quick, ground rules type stuff, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill. So our goal is to make this as tactical as possible. And so feel free to push us to be specific. We know that generalities like build alignment with your senior leaders is usually quite unhelpful because you're like, yep, I know that I'm supposed to do that. I might be confused about how to do that. So feel free to push us in the chat if we're not being specific and useful enough. Comments and Q&A, please feel free to use them. We got some really great questions that were submitted in advance. And then of course, welcome any pushes on things that might've been said, clarification questions, et cetera. We find an active chat to be quite fun. Standard, caveat here, none of this is legal advice, and we certainly urge you to speak to your counsel should you have any specific questions about how this pertains to you. And we also just in general encourage with questions to keep them somewhat vague and hypothetical in nature versus terribly specific, given the nature of what we're talking about. And then finally, maybe just kind of as like a getting to know you sort of exercise, something that you might find interesting is when we were doing this prep call, we sort of realized that we're all probably coming from one of three buckets of companies. One is a great one to be in, which is everything is sunshine and rainbows and there are no problems, everyone is aligned, phenomenal culture, et cetera. But this is like quite rare and aspirational. There might be on the other extreme, this kind of everything is awful and it's a dumpster fire and I'm just like really struggling here. And then I think most of us exist somewhere in this gray, this spectrum in between. And so what we're really trying to do is kind of speak to that. With that context out of the way, Bill, I would love to turn it over to you to kind of give us a lay of the land, what specifically happened. And if you don't mind, Melanie and I will kind of jump in and pepper you with questions as you go.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks, Roxanne. As Roxanne said, my name is Bill Dugan. I'm a partner at Baker McKenzie. I live in Chicago, have an office in Chicago, but I also, since we're saying we're all from, I have an office in New York and LA as well. So I kind of crisscross the country where many of you are. And I saw a couple people calling to say they're from Pittsburgh. I really like Pittsburgh, my second favorite baseball stadium in the country over Wrigley Field. So we'll get that out of the way. I know it is a Friday, and talking to lawyers at any time is usually not fun, and especially on a Friday. But as Roxanne said, we're going to try and make this just practical for you all. And of course, it's not legal advice, but we won't get into the weeds on the decision that we're here to talk about today. But we're just going to talk about how it's going to affect all of you moving forward. So as most people have probably seen, McDonald's has gotten some very bad press over its former CEO, as well as some other top officers, within the corporation, for some things that occurred over the last few years. And one of the fallouts of that is what was filed in Delaware, an action called a shareholder derivative suit. Again, not getting too far into the weeds on this, but a shareholder derivative suit is if you own shares in a company, any shareholder can bring one. And again, feeling that the corporation is not doing things that it should be doing, you can actually sue on behalf of the corporation. So it's really a shareholder bringing a suit on behalf of the corporation, and many of these are brought in Delaware. because that is the incorporation capital of the United States. You can incorporate in all states, but Delaware is where many folks go, and that's where many of these suits are brought. So,
And Bill, can I jump in with
Sure.
a quick question that I saw a couple of folks submitted? Could you explain how, if at all, this is going to vary? We have folks from very small, early stage startups all the way up to like large public companies. Anything you're saying kind of vary, or would you say like in general, sort of regardless of size, of course, complexity will increase, but this is kind of, this is a very common structure given most companies, whether they're startups or not, are Delaware corporations.
Sure. And if you have shareholders, this is whether you're public, private, this applies to you. Whether you're a company with 20 people, or if you're a company, with thousands of employees in your publicly traded corporation. So, for
Very
all
helpful.
folks, I mean, just to get an idea, I've been dealing with, shareholder issues with a privately held company just, this week. And so it will be applicable to all the folks, here. So it's a good question. Okay, so really kind of sort of what is the, what are the headlines here and why are we talking, to all of you? This basically comes down to, it's the first time that a Delaware court, has held that there can be officer liability in situations in these shareholder derivative suits. So what's an officer? What's a director? What's a manager? You have typically at companies, you will have your board of directors for a company, which that is the body essentially that has general oversight for the company. And then you have, and so that would be, again, chairperson of the board. You may have 3 people on a board, 5 people on a board, whatever it is, but those are not the ones that are managing the company on a day-to-day basis. You will have officers of the company, which we'll explain at certain times, can also be members of the board, but generally kind of view it as more of like the strategy oversight folks for a company. Then you will have your officers of a company, which your officers are, think of them as typically your C-suite executives, and could be just below that as well, but your top management, in a company, president of a company, chief human resources officer, chief financial officer. Those are the folks that are at the top management day to day.
And Bill, I'm going to ask a question I do
Sure.
not actually know the answer to, which is if someone has officer in their title, does that automatically mean they are an officer? And can you speak a little bit to how that designation happens? Because I feel like at startups, you might see titles that include officer quite early, for example.
Sure. Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, it's very difficult to give a black and white, answer to that. But if you have officer in your title, that does not automatically mean that you are an officer of the corporation. Although titles will be one thing that if there's a dispute, whether you are, an actual officer of the company, titles will be one thing that will be evaluated. So, again, it's sort of like, it when you see it almost. I mean, you're an officer of the company will be someone that is high enough up in the food chain, within the company. So again, you don't want to have officer in your title if you don't necessarily aren't going to be an officer of the company. But that's sort of for another day. So really what happened is shareholders brought a suit against in Delaware, on behalf of the company. And it was essentially well, we won't get into all the minutia of it, but essentially what was one of the basis of the lawsuits is that there was this, rampant sexual harassment culture, at McDonald's, chiefly by the former CEO. We'll also talk about, which is particular to here, the global head of human resources being involved. That was not appropriately responded to by the company. And so shareholders are bringing in a lawsuit on behalf of the company to address that situation. So really what the big thing is here is that the court held for the first time that officers of a company have the same duty of oversight as directors on the board of directors. So that is a significant shift. It's significant because the first time the Delaware courts have actually held that. It's been implied in earlier suits, but this is the first time that a court has actually come out and said it. So, what does that mean, like, practically? Okay, again, not to get into like all the legal, buzzwords, but there's this test, okay, that officers are going to be held to, and I'll just read it here because I think it helps. It's the officers must make a good faith effort to ensure that information systems are in place so that the officers receive relevant and timely information that they can provide to the board of directors. And second, officers have a duty to address red flags they identify or report upward to more senior officers or to the board. All right. So that is the outline of your duty as an officer. Boil it down to human resources. What does that mean for human resources? Okay, if you are the head of human resources, you have a duty, to make sure that there are good faith efforts that systems are put in place. And here we'll talk about sexual harassment, right? That you have systems within a company that are put in place, which I think, the vast majority of you will already have, that you have your policies, you have your reporting systems, you have all the things that employers have had, for a long time, since sexual harassment came out in the 80s, was the first time that was recognized. And that now is common to today. But where we are a little bit different here now is that, you as an officer of a company, again, we'll stick with human resources. If these red flags come up within, say, the sexual harassment context, and it can be anything, frankly, within your sphere as a human resources professional. But if these red flags come up, you have an affirmative duty to report them upwards to more senior officers and potentially to the board of directors as well. So we'll talk, I know, Roxanne, we're going to talk a little bit later on, about what does this mean on a practical level. But essentially what it means on a practical level is, if there are harassment issues that, you have a duty to raise those to, the president of the company, for example, or, towards the, to the board of directors, if, for instance, the president of the company is involved. It's kind of, again, I know a lot to take in here in the beginning, but one key thing here is, generally speaking, you will only have this duty and responsibility for overseeing your particular areas of responsibility. So, for instance, in human resources, you are generally not going to be responsible for, profit and loss statements of the company, right? That'll be more under the, chief financial officer's responsibilities. So again, it's sticking to your, column, unless there is something that is just, an exceptional circumstance, and that's the word that's used, exceptional circumstances, that you have to report something that's outside of your area. An exceptional circumstance, again, this would just be an example, and not necessarily everyone, has heard, like, FTX, the situation with them, right? If you're the global human resources officer for FTX, but you learn that FTX is taking money from another entity, and basically it would be a money laundering scheme, that would be an egregious example that you probably have a duty, to bring that to the board of directors. So again, that's where it stands here And I know we're going to talk about some practical application of that, but really, what's happened here is it's taken you as an officer of the company and potentially making individual liability, for instance, in a sexual harassment case, that normally, individuals are not going to be liable. Like, for instance, under federal law, under Title VII, if there's a sexual harassment situation, and say that the global head of human resources completely ignored it, and the company did not give a prompt remedial action, that would only be that lawsuit would only be against the company. You'd be a witness and you'd be deposed and to prove the company did not take prompt remedial action, but you would not have individual liability. Some states, there can be individual liability, but that's usually for the person committing the sexual harassment, himself or herself. But here, this does open the door for potential individual liability.
Super helpful. Maybe to do like a quick recap and maybe one question here, and then Melanie, would love to turn it over to you to kind of address like, okay, got it. This, like, the recap part is essentially in much less eloquent terms. Bill, if I've got you right, you're saying like the big difference is you're now on the hook. Personally, that's kind of the key distinction between the before times in which this was hinted at and the now time in which, this is the case. And it sounds like what on the hook means in part is set up the right systems, make sure that they're working. And then when flags do get raised in your sort of sphere, so we're mostly talking to HR people leaders right now. So a likely flag might be harassment, make sure that you take appropriate action, if I've kind of summarized you correct.
Right. Yep.
And then one thing I know that we were talking about in the prep call that was super interesting was actually kind of around like culture. So I feel like there can be this kind of perception that like sexual harassment exists in this, like just sort of the really extreme types of things. And people might say like, oh, a culture issue, that strikes me as kind of different and more like to use a maybe like very callous phrase, like a nice to have, but not a need to have. Could you talk a little bit about how like a toxic culture, a gossipy culture, a culture of drinking, like, with maybe not getting super into the details of this case, but how that might interact with, everything you just said?
Sure. And then this is just from this, case specifically with the former, head of human resources, for McDonald's. One of the issues was that this culture, this alleged culture of, inappropriate conduct in the C-suite, the allegations were that the global head of human resources actually participated in it. And we're talking about, some of the examples given in the case were, drinking on the executive floor of McDonald's, and then with, women on the laps of senior executives on the executive floor, with drinking, happening within McDonald's. Again, these are all allegations. This is not a case where things are like this. These things happened and it's been proved and all those sorts of things. So I want to make that clear, but that's part of the, system. That's part of the analysis with what were the red flags here. Right. And so if you take the allegations as true, which the court had to at that point in time, in the case, it's, yes, you might have had all kinds of systems in place, which again, like any other corporation would, with your policies, your hotlines, you name it, all of that. But if you're in charge of that, which again, you're head of human resources, you are in charge, that's in your column and in your, of responsibility, and you are participating in it, or you're ignoring it, then those red flags, and you're not raising that to the board or anyone else. So it's that two-prong test where you really just can't, stick your head in the sand and say, it's not on me. We put all these policies in place and had training and everything else, and I can't control what the C-suite is doing.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it goes to something we talk a lot about of like tone at the top. And obviously it's incredibly difficult if the tone at the top is actually the problem, instead of ideally sort of the solution. So that makes sense. Melanie, I think at this point, it would make sense to kind of turn to your section, which I'm happy to kind of tee up if you want to pull up the slides. So essentially, we just saw a lot of questions that were essentially like, okay, I got the TLDR that I'm on the hook. That seems deeply unfair because what if, I'm advocating for all of the things that Bill's been talking about, that kind of put in good systems, whether it's good policies, effective training, all of that. But I don't feel like I have buy-in from the entire C-suite, particularly perhaps the CEO or CFO. Like, what am I supposed to do? I'm in quite the pickle. Was like the theme of a lot of questions we got. And so Melanie helpfully has prepared kind of some like sort of helpful tactical things for people leaders to do who find themselves in some version of that situation. So at this point, I'm just going to become mostly a learner myself, but Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, hi all, and thank you both. I think, what's really interesting about what Bill has shared is that, it's not just the legal issue, and Roxanne, you hinted at this too. It's really sort of this idea that there was a pre-existing culture that then became an extreme toxic work culture that then became this very real, very public legal issue. And so, the question I'd actually like to throw out to everyone here, if you could just give me 1 to 5 in the comment section, and please don't make me sit here in awkward silence. Give me a number. 1 to 5, 5 being super surprised, 1 being not at all surprised. Who here is surprised by the concept that bad culture can lead to legal issues? Okay, yes, thank you. Oh gosh, you just saved me from like real mortification here. So thank you all. I really appreciate the participation here. Yeah, 1s across the board. If you all don't mind, I'm going to call on someone. And by the way, if you very much don't feel comfortable speaking, you can just say pass and I'll call on someone else. But I'd love to hear a little bit more in terms of, why is this not a surprise to anyone? Why does this feel like a pretty obvious concept in the world of HR? I'm going to call on Jade DeWitt. If you could unmute yourself. Amanda, who's helping us coordinate, is going to give you access. Tell me a little bit more about why this is not a surprising concept, why this is so obvious.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I think that, culture really defines a company and for various aspects of it. So if you are creating a culture where you're allowing any type of policy to be violated, any type of moral act to go unchecked, I think that it could lead to a number of issues, especially ones where you as a leader of a company or in a senior executive position are supposed to be held to a higher standard or holding your company to a higher standard.
100%. And you're touching on something really interesting, which is there's also grades of it, right? So it could be a singular employee, it could be a group environment that's being created within one team at the company, or it could be at the leadership level, right? Where there's now this trickle down effect and you're leading by example. And so you're creating this tone and sort of implicitly saying this is acceptable because a leader at the company is doing this as well. So thank you very much, Jade. So I think we can all agree that, this seems pretty obvious to us, right? And from the HR perspective, no surprise, right? Seems pretty clear. Bad culture leads to toxic workplace, leads to compliance problems. And on top of that, right, we also, as HR experts know, is not good for performance, right? When there's a toxic workplace, when there are legal issues, performance drops, right? People are not happy in their role. They stop giving 100%. We see that HR's bandwidth drops as well, right? Because we're so pulled in so many different directions from people, filing complaints or being upset or not doing their job or being disengaged, demoralized. And then ultimately it leads to retention issues, which we know is not just bad for morale, but is also a really expensive problem to deal with, having to backfill, taking up more time, right? And so the solution feels pretty clear, right? Invest in culture. Seems obvious, right? I feel like I'm not saying anything new to anyone on this call. And yet, when you talk to CEOs, you can sometimes get a different perspective, right? So some CEOs, when you make this business case, the response is, that's a future us problem, right? We need to focus on today problems, not a year from now problems. Or maybe, the culture is not that bad. I feel like you're maybe making this into a bigger deal than it is, or we've got more urgent issues that we need to focus on right now. Maybe they even say, you know what, if someone's not happy with our culture, they can leave, right? Not every company is for every employee. And I think that in this case, this applies. Maybe it's just a budgetary issue, right? Like, I hear you. I do believe you, but unfortunately, we just don't have time or the budget for this. Can I get a yes in the comment section if anybody on this call has ever experienced this? And I want to give you a no. It doesn't have to be at your current company. Ever in the past, at all, have you ever talked to someone on the leadership team and in the face of telling them we've got a culture issue that we need to address, you get this kind of response? Okay, yes. I have experienced this 100. Okay, yes, they are coming in. I'm seeing all caps. So there's some strong feelings around this. Let me call on someone else. I'm going to call on, let's say, Mark Garner. If you can unmute yourself, because I just love that you went the extra mile. You used an emoji in your response. 100%. How does it, like, tell me a little bit about the context, why you said yes, and then tell me, how it feels when you hear that sort of response.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. I think so coming from a startup culture where it's all hands on deck, roll up your sleeves, the prioritization isn't necessarily addressing culture per se, it's more operationally. And so these things just get deprioritized, which feels a little frustrating coming from the workplace experience, employee experience. I know from an HR background that these are leading indicators for business success, but that's not always the case for a C-suite to really have on their purview.
I hear you entirely. And I think you point to something really key here, which is it's obvious to you, but for whatever reason, something is not getting communicated to the other side. And so it's not obvious to the other person. Let me call on one more person, because I think this is something that probably a lot of people are struggling with, especially based on the questions that have come in. Fatima Roberts, and let me know if I mispronounced that, by the way, if you could tell us a little bit more about why you said yes and how it feels on your end.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have had it happen multiple times since the 90s, and now that the focus, there's a bigger focus and public focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I'm seeing it a little less because I think people at that level are saying, oh, now I need to be careful about how I approach these issues. However, in the past, they would say, oh, that's just the little people, or no, it's just those. And I literally had a C-suite leader tell me, that's just the brown people that have this problem, as though I wasn't part of the brown community. So I've seen it in a lot of different ways. And I'm so thankful that now I work for a very inclusive culture and I have a fantastic, group of people around me and in support of others. But those companies that took that attitude and the leaders had that, they also had a lot of legal problems, from sexual harassment, gender bias. They had a lot of lawsuits around a lot of things. And so it's one of those things where it's becoming less bold, but my concern, just to kind of put it out there, is that now it's going more into processes and procedures. They may not say these things, but there's always a way to business justify kind of allowing these behaviors that still cause these problems. That's been my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I just want to take a moment to say, I am so sorry that you had to experience that. That sounds awful. It's not acceptable. And for anyone else on this call who's experienced something similarly, that sucks. I'm sorry. It's not cool. And to Mark's point, right? These are, and to your point as well, Fatima, clearly these are leading indicators, right? It's not just one person. If something is happening at even any level, it's not surprising when I hear you say that company also faced many legal issues. So thank you very much for sharing. In fact, it's actually, it's a perfect segue into, this next slide, which is, I just want to acknowledge for everyone how tough this is, right? Not just at the company level or at your work level, but on a personal level, right? Having to go up and fight against these things day in and day out is exhausting on a personal level, on a work level, for the team that you're advocating for your employees. This can be tricky stuff. And you might walk away from these conversations feeling like you're not empowered, right? Maybe you're a teeny tiny team and you have so many other things on your plate. And on top of this, you now have to handle these issues that are coming up because of initiatives that you brought up that got shut down. Nobody paid attention, right? Or maybe you're feeling, maybe you are being personally dismissed, right? In the example that Fatima gave, right? Maybe you're just being misunderstood and no one's paying attention, or they're overlooking the HR perspective. Or maybe it's that you're facing rejection after rejection after rejection, only to then have to come in and do damage control when inevitably something goes wrong. So I just want to acknowledge how tough and exhausting and demoralizing this can be. I also want to acknowledge that there are other factors that can complicate these things, right? There are gender dynamics, right? The reality is the majority of CEOs identify as men. The majority of people in the HR world identify as women. There are gender dynamics. There are also race dynamics, as Fatima alluded to. There are power dynamics. This might literally be your direct boss who has direct influence and control over your own career. And you now have to argue with them and push back and convince them, right? Even if they are saying, no, how many times are you going to bring this up? We've talked about this before. I don't want to hear about this again, right? That can be really intimidating and exhausting. And there might even be some prior baggage, right? Maybe you've had a bad CEO in the past. Maybe your CEO has had a bad HR person in the past and it didn't work out well. And so now they're sort of like throwing assumptions both ways. And so that relationship is becoming even more difficult. The thing that I actually want to point to in all of this is I actually think that this ruling has presented us with a great opportunity and a great push, right? The legal aspect of this is not new. The concept that toxic work cultures are not okay and they lead to problems, not new, right? I don't think that the majority of people listening into this ruling are thinking about, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that we need to put structures in place to make sure these things don't happen or to make sure people can surface issues. I think we know that, and we've been doing that. What's really coming out of this and what's really sort of bubbling up in response to this ruling is we need better, more effective relationships with our leadership teams. We just do, in particular with our CEOs, and with the entire leadership team. And I think this ruling is a really good push for us to do this because too many times we work around it. We just put up with it. It's sort of like, oh gosh, CEOs, HR, we just aren't never going to see each other. I guess we have to find other ways. And what I actually think is, I think that's not true. I think there are ways that we can hear each other and understand each other and really empathize with each other on both sides for a more productive and effective relationship. So with that in mind, the thing that I think we need to do is think a little bit more about what drives our CEOs. As HR people, we're very focused on our employees, as we should be, right? What drives our employees? What engages our employees? What are they thinking about? What are they optimizing for? What are their goals? We need to be doing the same thing with our CEOs. Of course, our CEOs need to be doing that with us as well. But as us taking a first step, the first step I think could be, understanding who our CEO stakeholders are. Yes, they care about our employees. And I want to be clear that I truly believe that at the end of the day, we all have the same end goal. We are all trying to build a successful company. We're looking at that from different perspectives, as we should be. That's why we're hiring different kinds of experts, so that they're bringing different ideas to the table, different perspectives, different expertise. But at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, right? And so let's think about what our CEOs are looking at. They're thinking about their stakeholders, which tends to be board of directors, investors, shareholders. What are they optimizing for? Money. It's growing revenue, saving money, ultimately staying in business. In particular, if you're a tiny company, you might not know if you're even going to be in business 2 years from now. And so what you're thinking about, what is going to keep me in business today, right? I'm not worried about how we can be a great company 3 years from now. I'm worried about today, right? The reason that I think it's so important for us to think about this and keep this in mind is because I think that it can enable us to have better, more effective conversations. What do I mean by that? I think that oftentimes what we say gets lost in translation. The reason that we get those rejections from our CEOs and those responses is because they haven't actually heard what we're saying. To Mark's point, right? The thing that is clear to us that we know, they're not hearing it. They're thinking something else because they don't have the context that we have. So let's look at some common examples, right? we might say, hey, we need training for our managers. To us, this is obvious that we need training for our managers. Managers are the backbone of culture. If you have bad management, you're going to have bad culture, and that's going to lead to toxic work culture and then legal issues, right? Where were those managers when these things were happening? Well, what the CEO hears is, oh, so you want to pull our managers, our most senior people away from the things that are going to drive revenue today. That's what they're hearing, right? Or we need to invest in culture initiatives. What the CEO hears is, so we're going to pull money away from revenue producing initiatives, even though we know, of course, that that's not the case, right? In fact, we're going to lose more money if we don't invest in culture initiatives. One final example, you might say we have serious culture challenges that need to be addressed, and they might just hear, oh, it's a few employees that are unhappy. Because again, they don't have access to the things that we have access to. They're not looking at the surveys. They're not looking at the data. They're not day in and day out having people sign up to talk to them on their calendar, raising all these flags and all these issues that are coming up. So what can we do about it? How can we change the language that we're using so that we're heard? I think we can reframe so that we have more impact by optimizing for the things that our CEOs tend to be optimizing for. Obviously, I don't want to assume for all CEOs. I'm sure some CEOs are optimizing for the same thing. And I have to give like a big shout out to Roxanne, who is not only on the call, but who I have these discussions with all the time. And Roxanne, I hope I don't make you blush too much, but truly, if you remember all the times I've told you, I'm just like shocked that there was not that much pushback. You just agreed to the thing because you get it. So
appreciate the shout out, because I was mostly just sweating in the previous slides. And you're like, man, these CEOs here. But now that you gave me the mic, I want to jump in super quickly and just say that I do think some of the like even just that empathy building of understanding like what's top of mind for the quarter, something like that has been a great way that like you and I think have been able to build a relationship. If you understand like, hey, the priority of the whole company right now is marketing, for example. And so here's something I've come up with that's going to support that. I'm suddenly hearing like, oh, we're on the same team, and not you and I are sitting at opposite ends of the table where you're just like asking and not kind of thinking about the entire stakeholder group that I have. And so I think you do a phenomenal job with that.
thank you very much. Oh, I love that.
I'm a little less fast, yeah.
But I think that's exactly right? Like understanding what you're optimizing for, what your priorities are day to day, and how I can support you and how we can both support each other in our initiatives, right? And so an example of how we can reframe some of those sentences or statements from the last slide are, instead of just saying we need to train our managers, think about, hey, maybe they're prioritizing revenue right now. Maybe to Roxanne's point, they're thinking about marketing right now. So how do you make it clear to them? How do you connect the dots, right? And so one way you could say this is, hey, underperformance has actually led to $100,000 lost in revenue. Maybe you calculate this by seeing which deals fell through, which deals did not get pursued because there was an underperformer who didn't do the thing they were supposed to do, because there was a manager who didn't guide their direct report on how to do this process, because there was, disorganization and miscommunication across, cross-functional partners. And so something fell through, right? And so then you can explain, here's how effective management would have mitigated that loss, right? And here's how we can avoid that happening again. And then you go into management training, right? But you need to make sure that they're understanding what you're seeing, right? You can't just make the assumption that they understand how this ties to revenue. Another way that you could say we need to invest in culture initiatives, hey, increased turnover has actually led to drops in productivity, increased spend, several missed goals. Now, make sure you're using specifics here, right? How do you show that there's been a drop in productivity? Maybe the sales team has been chasing after fewer prospects. Maybe the engineering team has been able to complete, far fewer projects this quarter because people are quitting and there's not enough backup for them, right? Increased spend. How much money goes into recruiting a new person, onboarding, getting them their equipment, getting them their swag, training them, right? And in the meantime, we didn't have someone who was up and running, so we lost all this time and productivity, right? You want to point to really specific, tangible things that make sense to your CEO. And then finally, I think this is the big one, especially as we're talking about today's topic, right? Over the past year, and if you've been in HR long enough, this is not going to be a surprise to you how expensive it is to deal with legal issues rather than mitigating them from the start, right? And that can be a hard thing for people to conceptualize, by the way, right? It's not a problem until it's a problem, so we don't need to think about it. But really, if we had avoided this problem, we would have saved ourselves, let's say, $100,000 in legal fees or more, or 20 hours in trying to figure out this situation and try and do damage control and, figuring out this legal suit, right? Here's how we can avoid that moving forward. So this is the way that you can start communicating to have more impact with your audience. The thing I also want to say is, you might get no the first time around, right? They're not foolproof. It might still not be a priority for your leadership team or your CEO. That doesn't mean that you should end the discussion. In fact, I think it's actually a good opportunity to dig deeper, right? Ask smart follow-up questions. Don't just walk away with a no. It's similar to how, when we tell people about if they're looking for a promotion and the answer is no, you don't just say no and walk away. You say, okay, so when can we revisit this discussion? What steps would I have to take to get to promotion? It's very similar here, right? Okay, if it's a no today, then what would be a more doable version of rolling out manager training? So maybe it's not 4 hours of training, maybe it's 1 hour of training, maybe it's a 30 minutes is what you're willing to accept. Okay, great. So let's replace the all hands with manager training. Boom, we didn't need to take any more time. We just did the thing with the same amount of time that we had already allocated for the company. Or, what are your top priorities now? Similar to what Roxanne was saying, oh, marketing is your focus right now. Okay, cool. Let's talk about how we optimize for marketing. Which parts of this proposal are blocking you? Sometimes there's one little thing that is a no. Maybe it's the cost. Okay, great. What's a free way that we can do this? What's a cheaper way that we can do this? How can we leverage an existing budget to do this, right? Maybe it's a no, but it's a no, not forever, just no right now. Maybe it's next quarter. So make sure you're asking smart questions. Even I like this last one, which is, what would have to happen for this to be a today problem for you? Because it might be that they're not understanding how high priority this is. And so it might be, oh, this is what would have to happen. Like it would have to be this bad. And maybe it already is that bad and you just have to explain it to them. Or maybe it's not that bad. And so you keep an eye out for when it does get that bad, right? But make sure that you're using all of these conversations as opportunities to learn more, deeper, and have more productive, effective conversations. And then the last thing I want to point out is, know that you don't need to have a ton of money, a ton of bandwidth to set up the right infrastructures. You can do lower lift options, right? You can make your policies more accessible. For example, we actually will share afterwards our dating policy, for example, and how it's easily digestible. It's short, it's to the point, but it gets people paying attention. You could offer office hours, for example, right? That's an easy way to make sure that you're available in case anybody ever wants to flag an issue. You could do a low lift lunch and learn, right? Maybe you send out a video, a 2-minute fun video for people to watch, and then you just talk about it in your lunch and learn. Hey, what questions do you have? That way you don't have to spend too much time planning, working. It's just you set aside the time and anyone who's interested signs up, right? You could also leverage, existing resources. There are a lot of free resources out there. When you follow smart people, you'll see this kind of stuff. Athena actually, and we'll promote this a little bit more later, but we actually have a free manager training that we're really, really excited about that talks about this specific kind of thing, right? What are the things that managers typically aren't getting trained on that could really lead to toxic work cultures if we don't catch it from the start? This is a free training that anyone can enroll in, right? So make sure, if budget is the thing, cool, check out Athena's training. And then you can also leverage existing budgets and initiatives. So remember that you don't have to make a new budget for everything, right? For example, compliance training, everyone's legally required to do it. You got to do harassment prevention training. That's not optional. So how do we pick harassment prevention training that's going to double as culture building, like for example, Athena's training, but how do you do one that's actually going to have higher impact, that's going to maximize on the output rather than, okay, well, here we'll focus on compliance, but then here is when we'll talk about culture. Why not combine them, do 2 in 1? So make sure that you're really thinking creatively out of the box. There's always a way to do the thing that you need to do. I know, Roxanne, that we have a few questions coming up, so I'll pass it over to you, but certainly if anybody has any other questions or thoughts based on anything that I've shared here, drop it in the Q&A, because if we have time, we'll get to those as well.
Definitely. I've got some that were submitted, like Melanie said, in advance. And then, yeah, please put any, that have come up for you, and we might be able to get to 1 or 2. But before we jump in there, I wanted to say, Melanie, I think I've seen you do the previous slide quite effectively, sometimes with, I imagine most of you in your companies have kind of a dedicated, like all hands or team activity time. And so sometimes if Melanie is, for example, advocating for some sort of team activity, just saying like, hey, why don't we just take the 15 minutes that we were going to use for something else and instead repurpose it for that, especially if it's something like at the end of the quarter when I'm already thinking like, oh, the rest of the team really has a bunch of initiatives they need to run on. Just that reframe of it doesn't need to be net new. Instead, it can be within our all hands. Suddenly, as a CEO, makes me feel like, oh, this isn't really an ask. This is like, just optimizing current time. And that alone feels like much lighter, much easier for me to just like thumbs up emoji that one. Melanie, the first question is actually for you. And it is, I think you had pretty well answered this like alignment question. So maybe what advice do you have for like up and coming HR professionals who are now stepping into perhaps their first HR leadership role, navigating this, like, as you called out, very tricky environment?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Anyone who was on my last webinar, apologies if this is redundant, but I think that is a really important point for everyone to remember, which is it's literally your job as an HR person to surface issues. That's your job. And so if you're getting pushback based on the fact that you are surfacing issues, that's something that you actually need to flag to your leadership team, right? Remind them, you hired me to do this, right? Like part of my job is to help you build effective work cultures. It's also to make sure that we don't do anything dumb to get the company in trouble. It's also my job to surface issues. It's also my job to help make sure that you know what's going on at the company so we can address it. The other thing that I'd say is, if you're thinking, I'm a little bit nervous on a personal level, like this stuff makes me nervous because I could be held personally liable or, anything like that. I think that it's okay to lean into that and let your manager know, for example, like this is a thing I'm concerned about. Can we talk about it? Right. Sometimes they just don't know. Again, like I really think empathy is like the key to all our problems, right? Like understanding that, like assuming good intent and thinking like maybe they just don't know what I'm feeling and what I'm concerned about and why this is such a priority for me. And the same is true too for you, right? Like you might not understand like why it is that this isn't a priority for them, why it is that they feel okay with this, why it is that they're saying no. And it's not to say that either one is right or wrong, but the more that we can understand and build those communications more effectively, the better. And then finally, I'll say that, especially if you're new and up and coming, I think follow smart people. In particular, what can happen is when you're on an HR team, especially if you're on a smaller team, you tend to be siloed. There are fewer people that you can reach out to, that you can partner with, that you can brainstorm with. And so it can feel sort of like this echo chamber of ideas. And then, maybe it even builds insecurity and self-doubt for you. I think follow smart people, join people communities, ask smart questions, and lean on the resources that others have already put out there, because there are a ton out there. Like literally just run a Google search. Athena, for example, we have a blog series that really, we have so many downloadables. We have, here's our dating policy. You can download it and copy it. We're rolling out our DEI philosophy. You can download it and copy it, right? Lean on the expertise of others while you are building your own expertise. And do remember that, empower yourself, because this is literally your job. This is what they hired you to do. And so don't feel scared to push on these things.
One other thing that makes me think of is from a CEO perspective, that's very similar to, for example, finance and legal. So to the extent that your companies have those functions, it's also their jobs to raise to, for example, me, like risks or concerns or anything like that. And so if you're struggling, you may want to reach out to your colleagues in either, finance or legal, to the extent you have those, because they might have found a way to, effectively advocate for things at your company. I know we're getting close on time, so I'll do one more question. This one for Bill, kind of a summary of a couple of questions that came through in advance, which is essentially like not the most, optimistic, but I completely understand the sentiment, which is like, how should people leaders kind of demonstrate that they have been doing the best that they can? To sort of some questions around, should we be logging and documenting steps? Like, is there a formal process? Just kind of a group of questions around any particular proactive measures people leaders should be taking.
Yeah, on the bad portion of it, right? Your own liability and mitigating against risk. Make sure that your scope of responsibilities are defined. Number two, once you know that your scope of responsibilities are defined, that you have the right systems in place. to address, any issues, again, using the harassment, discrimination, the system in place would be, a reporting procedure that works, the handbooks, all those sorts of things. And that obviously it's being, if you have, which I've seen, clients will have hotlines or whatever else, and they're not being monitored, right? So make sure not only your systems are in place, but that they're actually working. And then the final thing is, answer what, yeah, it is documentation that, you are raising these issues and, to the appropriate folks. That would be obviously the people in the, C-suite, the president. If she's ignoring and you need to go, higher, it is documentation that, you have made these issues known within the corporation. Oftentimes there is a, for a board meeting, depending upon the company, the head of human resources has an opportunity to present at a board meeting. And so, again, make sure that, you have documentation that you have raised these issues within the corporation. So if you know your scope, have controls in place, and raise the issues from a liability standpoint, you will not, extremely low for you to have any.
Very helpful. And actually, because Bill, you were so succinct, lawyers on Fridays are fun and informative. I'll get a second one in, which was just folks were asking, do you see this trend continuing? So I think in general, kind of asking outside the HR world, I think you kind of touched on that in your first explanation, which is this has already expanded. It's just about your scope, meaning HR is sort of responsible for people issues, finance for finance, but I'll let you expand on that a little more if you've got anything.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, in general, as we all know, just your areas and responsibilities and your potential risk are, it's a good way that's actually continuing to expand, because we're going to see, more government intervention, more laws with local, state, federal level, which shows, I think, that on the good portion of it, that, people are important and your position is important. This is not like, the 1970s or 1980s where HR was looked at as personnel people, is what they were called, right? Go process payroll. And that's how you were, HR was viewed. That's not the case anymore. So, with more responsibility comes more risk, right? But it's great that you're having more responsibility and folks actually, paying attention to what we all do in the human resources sphere.
I like that ending on an optimistic note, that there really has been a kind of a general recognition of the importance of culture very broadly. I think Mark was talking about that, so totally agree. Amazing. At this point, we're going to wrap up. We have a couple of fun slides. The first one being, Melanie mentioned this. I'm super proud, and because Melanie is quite humble, I can just brag on her behalf. So essentially, we've just gotten so many requests from folks who've attended webinars, followed Melanie's content, et cetera, on LinkedIn, that like, hey, this would be really useful information to have for my managers. I would love to, for example, help them navigate what's a really tricky situation, which is being a peer one day and being a manager the next. And how do I make sure that those managers are not creating toxic work environments and instead sort of being that like bellwether, that really strong like culture carrier at your company? And so Melanie created a free course that you can take and you can send to managers at your company. And you can send it to a small group. You can send it to all your managers. It's about 25 or so minutes. I am almost complete with it because I personally found it just like incredibly useful. These are best practices that are always helpful to revisit and kind of keep sharp. So feel free to check this out. And again, you'll be able to sign up. There's no cost to take it. There's no cost to send it to managers. And the quality, given it is Melanie, is exceptionally high. And then, because feedback is crucial, we would love yours. Please give us feedback on this webinar, what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of, any topics that are top of mind, et cetera. Because just like a good company culture is built through feedback really trickling up, we found that we can make really great content for you all when we hear what you think. And then last, excited to announce that we've got an upcoming webinar on April 4th. And the topic, Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but is really about performance management and how to deal with that incredibly tricky topic of navigating a situation where you find yourself managing someone who's not performing. Anything else you want to say on it?
I think that we all know performance and management is one of the toughest parts of HR. So I definitely encourage everyone to check out. I feel like anytime I'm on a people group, people are talking about it. So highly encourage everyone to sit in. I actually, Roxanne, I know we just have like 2 minutes left, but I want to ask you a question real quick as we're like wrapping up and
Put me on
people.
the spot. Let's do it.
Yeah. I was thinking about the fact that like you are as a CEO so open to a lot of the things that I bring to you from the HR perspective. And I think it'd be really helpful to understand like, why is that? Like, why does it like what? Well, but like almost like from a perspective of like, for maybe for a CEO who's struggling to see it, why do the dots feel so clear to you? Like, why is it so clear that HR initiatives are like a very real priority for us as a business, just as much as like a revenue producing sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the most succinct answer is candidly, like I've been in orgs that didn't have good people and good culture, and I've been in ones that have. And like the comparison is just really stark. So I've written about this a bit. My background is actually as an Army officer, and often leaders will change like command over small units, and I'll be in a unit that had a great leader and everything felt like I was included, I was safe, all of it. And then the leader switches out and suddenly that unit looks really different. And the culture is very different, whether that's around ethics or around inclusion and how women were treated, how people of color were treated. It just like from one day to the next would switch. And then I've been, in places that have valued it. I've seen the benefit, in running Athena of having a really strong performance culture. And I think there's just like no way to do that without having a strong culture. People need to understand what the performance standards are. People need to know how to uphold them. And so I feel like it's maybe a bit of a like, I touched the flame, it was hot, kind of thing of like when you're in a not very strong, healthy cultural environment, it's just not great. I'm happy to maybe like, put some of those resources on LinkedIn. I've written a little bit about it to the extent it would be helpful for anyone to share with their CEO. But yeah, I think unfortunately that personal experience with it has definitely made me see the light, as it were.
Thanks.
You bet. All right, folks. Huge thanks for coming out today on a Friday and spending time with us. Thanks, Bill and Melanie, for your brains and really bringing this topic to light, and hope to see you all at the next Athena webinar.
Thanks so much.
Bye all.